This article discusses similarities and differences between social anarchism and anarcho-capitalism, and the history of debates regarding the two philosophies. Historically, social anarchism has always been the mainstream within anarchism, individualist anarchism, and anarcho-capitalism in particular, despite antecedents going back to the 19th century. A minority currents. Anarcho-capitalists believe anarcho-capitalism to be a form of individualist anarchism, although many individualist anarchists oppose this view because individualist anarchism has historically opposed capitalism. Social anarchists tend to believe anarcho-capitalism is not a form of anarchism due to the view of capitalism as inherently authoritarian. Anarcho-capitalists, on the other hand, tend to believe social anarchism as a form of collectivism, which they view as a threat to individual autonomy. Background: anarcho-capitalism is seen as a form of individualist anarchism by several scholars. All of the classical individualist anarchists opposed profit-making and, hence, capitalism as it is commonly defined today. Nevertheless, anarcho-capitalism, which has no opposition to profit, is sometimes regarded as a form of individualist anarchism in recent times. For example, contemporary individualist anarchist Daniel Burton, who believes that most modern-day individualist anarchists are class war anti-capitalists, nonetheless says that anarcho-capitalism is a type of individualist anarchism. Individualist anarchist Lawrence Labadie argued that Rothbard upholds presumably in his courts the very economic evils which are at bottom the very reason for human contention and conflict. Wendy McElroy calls herself both an individualist anarchist and an anarcho-capitalist, and Italian anarcho-capitalist Guglielmo Piombini regards anarcho-capitalism as a form of individualist anarchism. Historian Ralph Rago regards it as a form of individualist anarchism. Simon Tormey, in his book Anti-Capitalism, A Beginner's Guide, places no anti-capitalist restriction on being an individualist anarchist. Pro-capitalist anarchism is, as one might expect, particularly prevalent in the U.S., where it feeds on the strong individualist and libertarian currents that have always been a part of the American political imaginary. To return to the point, however, there are individualist anarchists who are most certainly not anti-capitalist, and there are those who may well be. Some anarcho-capitalists argue that the philosophy is related to individualist anarchism. They believe a major difficulty in resolving the debate is due to the conflicting definitions of the words anarchism and capitalism as used by the two sides. The traditions that object to the term anarcho-capitalism tend to use the term anarchism to refer to political movements that are both anti-statist and anti-capitalist. Conversely, libertarians and anarcho-capitalists most commonly apply the term anarchism to any philosophy that opposes all forms of initiatory coercion. However, even this is disputed, as most anarchists argue that capitalism is inherently coercive. Lysander Spooner's articles, such as No Treason and the Letter to Thomas Bayard, were widely reprinted in early anarcho-capitalist journals, and his ideas, especially his individualist critique of the state and his defense of the right to ignore or withdraw from it, were often cited by anarcho-capitalists. Spooner was staunchly opposed to government interference in economic matters, and supported a right to acquire property as one of the natural, inherent, inalienable rights of men, one which government has no power to infringe. Like all anarchists, he opposed government regulation. All legislative restraints upon the rate of interest are arbitrary and tyrannical restraints upon a man's natural capacity amid natural right to hire capital, upon which to bestow his labor. Quote, He was particularly vocal, however, in opposing any collusion between banks and government, and argued that the monopolistic privileges that the government granted to a few bankers were the source of many social and economic ills. Benjamin Tucker supported private ownership of the product of labor, which he believed entailed a rejection of both collective and capitalist ownership. He was a staunch advocate of the mutualist form of recompensing labor, which holds to cost the limit of price. He also advocated a free market economy, which he believed was prohibited by capitalist monopoly of credit and land backed by the state. He believed that anyone who wishes should be allowed to engage in the banking business and issue the private currency without needing special permission from government, and that unused land should not be restricted to those who wished to use it. He believed that if these and other coercive actions were eliminated, that profit in economic transactions would be rendered nearly impossible, because of increased availability of capital to all individuals and resulting increased competition in business. Accepting the labor theory of value and the resulting cost principle as a premise marks one of mutualism's main conflicts with anarcho-capitalism. Although his self-identification as a socialist and sympathy for the labor movement led to hostility from some early anarcho-capitalists such as Robert Lefebvre, others, such as Murray Rothbard, embraced his critique of the state and claimed that he defined his socialism not in terms of opposition to a free market in private property, but in opposition to government privileges for business. However, individualists argue that capitalism cannot be maintained in the absence of the state. For example, Kevin Carson argues, as a mutualist anarchist, I believe that expropriation of surplus value, i.e., capitalism, cannot occur without state coercion to maintain the privilege of usurer, landlord, and capitalist. It was for this reason that the free market mutualist Benjamin Tucker, from whom right libertarians selectively borrow, regarded himself as a libertarian socialist. Tucker characterized the economic demands of Proudhon and Warren by saying, though opposed to socializing the ownership of capital, they aimed nevertheless to socialize its effects by making its use beneficial to all instead of a means of impoverishing the many to enrich the few. Absolute free trade at home, as well as with foreign countries, the logical carrying out of the Manchester Doctrine, laissez-faire the universal rule. Anarcho-capitalism is sometimes viewed by those sympathetic to it as a form of individualist anarchism, despite the fact that the original individualist anarchists universally rejected capitalism. Organizations such as Mutualist.org remain dedicated to free market anti-capitalism, while individualists like Larry Gambone explicitly state that all capitalism is state capitalism. Nonetheless, anarcho-capitalist Wendy McElroy considers herself to be an individualist, while admitting that the original individualists were universally anti-capitalist. In addition, historian Guglielmo Piombini considers anarcho-capitalism a form of individualist anarchism, though he offers no support for this statement. Social anarchist author Ian MacKay and historian Peter Sabatini both argue that anarcho-capitalism is fundamentally opposed to individualist anarchism. The similarity to anarcho-capitalism in regard to private defense of liberty and property is probably best seen in a quote by 19th century individualist anarchist Victor Yeros. While the claim is controversial, some scholars regard anarcho-capitalism as being a form of individualism anarchism. However, other scholars, and many individualist anarchists themselves, do not accept anarcho-capitalism as a form of individualist anarchism. Individualist are not, as they assert that anarchism is fundamentally opposed to capitalism. As individualist anarchist Joe Peacock says, individualist anarchists have continued to espouse the labor theory of value, finding profit to be unnatural and exploitative. In the mainstream, however, the popularity of the labor theory of value of classical economics was superseded by greater acceptance of the subjective theory of value of neoclassical economics. Eventually, in the 1950s, Murray Rothbard coined the term anarcho-capitalism to define his anti-statist, laissez-faire capitalist philosophy. Rothbard noted that while strongly tempted, he could not call his ideology individualist anarchism because Spooner and Tucker have in a sense preempted that name for their doctrine, and that from that doctrine I have certain differences. Rothbard also supported unregulated banking, as Tucker and other individualists did, but believed that Tucker and Spooner had a flawed understanding of economics to believe that unregulated banking would eliminate profit from interest. Rothbard says interest rates are ultimately determined by the time value of money, rather than the supply of money, and that interest profit would still exist in a free banking environment. He says, "It has been particularly distressing to me as an ardent admirer of Spooner and Tucker to find that the followers have emphasized and concentrated on the totally fallacious monetary views almost to the exclusion of all else, and even bring them forth as a panacea for all economic and social ills." Rothbard suggested that individualist anarchists drop the labor theory of value, which he believed to be erroneous and leading to a false conclusion that profit was exploitative or unnatural in laissez-faire. Rothbard sought to introduce Lockean property rights and marginalism into individualist anarchism. Rothbard also rejected Tucker and Spooner's support of a system where there is no written law. He says, instead, he argues, individualist anarchist Lawrence Labadie responded that mere common sense would suggest that any court would be influenced by experience, and any free market court or judge would in the very nature of things have some precedents guiding them in their instructions to a jury. But since no case is exactly the same, a jury would have considerable say about the heinousness of the offense in each case, realizing that circumstances alter cases, and prescribing penalty accordingly. This appeared to Spooner and Tucker to be a more flexible and equitable administration of justice possible or feasible, human beings being what they are. But when Mr. Rothbard quibbles about the jurisprudential ideas of Spooner and Tucker, and at the same time upholds presumably in his courts the very economic evils which are at bottom the very reason for human contention and conflict, he would seem to be a man who chokes at a gnat while swallowing a camel. However, this criticism is specific to Rothbard's suggested version of anarcho-capitalism rather than to anarcho-capitalism in general. There are anarcho-capitalists who pose the existence of all statutory law, such as Morris and Linda Tan Hill. Individualist anarchism is a broad philosophy with various theorists having their own suggested versions. Philosopher Brad Spangler also finds fault in the understanding of Rothbard's political philosophy held by self-described left anarchists. Spangler makes the argument that what we typically call anarcho-capitalism is in fact a stigmergic socialism. "It is my contention," writes Spangler, "that Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism is misnamed because it is actually a variety of socialism, in that it offers an alternative understanding of existing capitalism as systematic theft from the lower classes and envisions a more just society, without that oppression. Rather than depending upon the labor theory of value to understand this systematic theft, Rothbardian market anarchism utilizes natural law theory and Lockean principles of property and self-ownership taken to the logical extreme as an alternative framework for understanding and combating oppression." Quote, He goes on to call Murray Rothbard a visionary socialist, admitting that it would likely cause Rothbard fits to be characterized as such. Though some scholars say that anarcho-capitalism is a form of anarchism, most anarchists disagree. Some writers on anarchism point out that anarcho-capitalism and most other forms of anarchism are very different, calling it right libertarianism rather than left libertarianism, but maintaining that it is still anarchism. Peter Marshall simply concludes that few anarchists would accept anarcho-capitalists into the anarchist camp. Some anarchists maintain strongly that anarcho-capitalism is not a form of anarchism due to the belief that anarchism is necessarily anti-capitalist as well as anti-statist. They note that, historically, those who called themselves anarchist have been opposed to what they called capitalism, and that anarchists like Proudhon, Bacon and Kropotkin and Tucker all called themselves socialists, and they argue that anarcho-capitalism is judged to be anarchism largely because anarcho-capitalists say they are anarchists and because they criticize the state. Significantly, few anarchists who called themselves socialist defined anarchism as purely opposition to the state. For example, Enrico Malatesta argued that the oppressed sought to overthrow both state and property. Then it was that anarchism was born. More recent anarchist thinkers have also noted that anarchism has not been solely concerned with the state. Critics have sometimes contended that anarchist thought, and classical anarchist theory in particular, has emphasized opposition to the state to the point of neglecting the real hegemony of economic power. This interpretation arises, perhaps, from a simplistic and overdrawn distinction between the anarchist focus on political domination and the Marxist focus on economic exploitation. There is abundant evidence against such a thesis throughout the history of anarchist thought. Both social anarchists and anarcho-capitalists refer to the etymological origins of the word anarchy as without rulers. Conventionally, anarchists interpret this to mean anything fitting the definition of ruler. Anarcho-capitalists specifically interpret this to apply to any form of institutionalized coercion, arguing that in a society free from coercion, no institution can exist to prevent a person from following another. Anarcho-capitalists further argue that the forced prevention of any voluntary action creates a coercive hierarchy, a ruler class and a ruled class. They argue that this class structure exists everywhere and only where coercion prevails. Classical American individualist anarchists in the Josiah Warren or Benjamin Tucker tradition favored small local market, also opposing the existence of social class structure since it, they argue, cuts individual liberty by making some people work and receive orders from others above. However, the classical American individualist anarchists opposed what they called capitalism, believing that profit would decrease approaching zero and a free market anarchy. Many scholars such as David Osterfeld and David Miller view anarcho-capitalism as a 20th century modification of the type of individualist anarchism that was popular in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholar of political philosophy Ian Adams says it is not, in fact, the case that anarcho-capitalism came out of the blue without past pedigree. It has a good deal in common with the early American tradition of individualist anarchism. Anti-capitalist anarchists tend to reject such claims, noting that many of the individualist anarchists called themselves socialists, and that all had a vision of a free society at odds with what they called capitalism. However, the scholars making the assertion that anarcho-capitalism is a more recent form of individualist anarchism are aware that 19th century individualist anarchists were opposed to capitalism anarcho-capitalism. The assertion is that anarcho-capitalism is a subjectivist form of individualist anarchism. In other words, opposition to profit is not a necessarily condition of being an individualist anarchist. Nevertheless, one anti-capitalist individualist anarchist laments, "It is time that anarchists recognize the valuable contributions of individualist anarchist theory and take advantage of its ideas. It would be both futile and criminal to leave it to the capitalist libertarians." Anarchist author Ian MacKay argues that individualism is essentially anti-capitalist and that anarcho-capitalism's claim to the tradition require reading individualist anarchists out of context. Individualist anarchist Joe Peacock argues that individualism rejects capitalist economic arrangements. One set of approaches concludes that capitalism, by necessity, requires a state, and therefore capitalism cannot exist without a state. For example, Larry Gambone states, "For anarchists, capitalism is the result of the development of the state and therefore, all capitalism is in one sense, state capitalism." Quote. He adds that when the anarchists use the term capitalism, they are referring to those who have gained wealth from the use of governmental power or from privileges granted by government. Anarcho-capitalist Wendy McElroy says that when 19th-century individualist anarchists referred to capitalism, they meant state capitalism, the alliance of government and business. Using this understanding of the manifestation of capitalism, some have argued that anarcho-capitalism is not truly a form of capitalism to begin with, and that therefore anarcho-capitalism is just as anti-capitalist as Tucker and Spooner. Left libertarian Brad Spangler, for example, has argued that anarcho-capitalism, properly understood, is a stigmergic form of socialism. For those that maintain that anarcho-capitalism is, in fact, a form of capitalism, the issue of contention then becomes whether or not capitalism can be created, or maintained, in the absence of a state that intervenes in private property claims. Anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard noted a difference between two contradictory concepts of capitalism: free market capitalism, characterized by voluntary exchange, and state capitalism, characterized by violent expropriation. He believed that only free market capitalism is true capitalism and as such the fullest expression of anarchism. However, most anarchists would agree with scholar Jeremy Jennings' statement that it is hard not to conclude that these ideas, with roots deep in classical liberalism, are described as anarchist only on the basis of a misunderstanding of what anarchism is. Rights, egalitarianism. Social anarchists are opposed to concentrations of wealth as this, they argue, results in economic power and limits the individual freedom of others. They argue that inequalities in wealth results in a situation where the many have little choice but to sell their liberty. Use of force. Anarcho-capitalists and other anarchists identifying with non-violent struggle subscribe to the general rule that physical force should not be initiated, but reserved for defense. Some of the 19th-century individualist anarchists, such Josiah Warren and Lysander Spooner, based their individualism on natural law, but many were egoists, believing that no rights exist without contract that results out of individual self-interest. Benjamin Tucker says, "I see no reason, as far as moral obligation is concerned, why one should not subordinate to destroy the other. But if each of these men can be made to see that the other's free life is helpful to him, then they will agree not to invade each other. In other words, they will equalize their existences, or rights to existence, by contract. Before contract is the right of might. Contract is the voluntary suspension of the right to might. The power secured by such suspension we may call the right of contract. These two rights, the right of might and the right of contract, are the only rights that ever have been or ever can be. So-called moral rights have no existence. Anarcho-capitalist David Friedman also subscribes to a contractual view of rights, as opposed to anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard's natural law basis. Historically, many self-described anarchist theorists, activists, and revolutionaries have advocated and employed violence that was not in self-defense. Particularly, insurrectionary anarchism places a specific spotlight on the concept of the attack in order to achieve anarchy. Notable figures include Emma Goldman, the Invisible Committee, Alexander Berkman, Peter Gelderloos, Pierre Proudhon, and those in the illegalist strain. This feature is far from universal, however, with major left anarchist figures defending pacifism. Defense. Anarcho-capitalists advocate private competition in defense, and in a sense require it due to their emphasis on private property, interest, rent and profit. Rothbard defines anarchism as a system which provides no legal sanction for such aggression, and said that what anarchism proposes to do, then, is to abolish the state, i.e., to abolish the regularized institution of aggressive coercion. Quote, however, anarchists are unimpressed by this claim. They simply reply that this is privatizing, not abolishing, the state. David Vicke, for instance, argues that it would be better called feudalism. Similarly, anarchists ask who defines what is and is not a legal sanction, and what is and is not aggressive coercion. Rothbard would assert that the violator of the property right of the victim would be the aggressor. This claim is justified using natural law theory, while individualist anarchists expect that one would defend their own property through possession. Some, such as Tucker and Spooner, support private defense to protect property. Tucker differentiates protection from rent attacks, because the primary form of protection would be possessive, saying that defense is a service like any other service, that it is labor both useful and desired, and therefore an economic commodity subject to the law of supply and demand.